What if the greatest horror in the Red Queen's reign was not what she did to her enemies, but what she did to the children who shared her blood? That question is where every forbidden chronicle begins, whispered by scholars who realized too late that the palace archives had been edited, redacted, cut open, and sewn shut again. Because the truth of her motherhood was never meant to survive. It begins in the nursery, not the throne room, in a chamber where silk curtains hid bruises and lullabies were replaced with commands. Her children grew up knowing that affection was a weapon and that a smile from their mother often meant danger instead of comfort. Servants recorded how the Red Queen would sit perfectly still for hours, watching her children play, not with tenderness but with calculation, as if each small gesture revealed whether they were threats in the making. The first twist in this story is that she did not begin as a monster. Early court letters describe her as brilliant, perceptive, unusually protective. But after the assassination attempt that nearly ended her reign, something changed. Her love for her children transformed into obsession, then into suspicion, then into something far darker. She became convinced that one of them would replace her before she was ready to relinquish power. Every whisper, every glance between siblings, every moment she did not witness became evidence of conspiracy. She built a secret chamber adjacent to the nursery, hidden behind carved cedar panels where she listened through the walls. Her paranoia turned motherhood into surveillance, and her children grew up breathing fear as naturally as air. The second twist comes when the punishments begin. At first, they were psychological. She separated the siblings for days, sometimes weeks, claiming it built discipline. But the truth was simpler. Isolation fractures loyalty. It weakens shared identity. And in time, it taught the children to fear one another almost as much as they feared her. Then the punishments escalated. Records found in the physician's notes mention corrective rituals, though the details were erased. A servant's hidden diary describes nights when the queen summoned a child alone, and the others heard muffled cries behind locked doors, followed by hours of silence. No one dared intervene. To witness was to die. But the most chilling part is this. The children began to turn on themselves. The queen engineered competitions, silent ones, cruel ones, rewarding obedience with fleeting moments of safety. She made them confess imaginary betrayals, made them accuse one another, made them believe that survival depended on proving loyalty in ways no child should ever understand. Their world shrank to a single truth. Their mother was both protector and executioner, nurturer and predator, the only source of affection and the only source of terror. And still, none of them knew how much worse it would become in the years that followed, when punishment transformed into ritual, and ritual into something that no historian can fully explain without trembling. Before we go deeper, tell me something. Have you ever wondered how love can be twisted into a weapon? How a parent's fear can scar generations? If any part of this unsettles you, leave a comment sharing what struck you the most. Tap like to help this story reach others who want the truth behind royal myths, and check whether you're subscribed so you don't miss the next chapter. What comes next will reveal the first irreversible fracture inside that royal household, and nothing about their lives was the same after it. The fracture inside the royal household began quietly, almost invisibly, long before the outside world sensed anything was wrong. After the night when the Red Queen imposed her first irreversible punishment, a strange shift unfolded among the children. They no longer looked at each other as siblings, but as extensions of her will, each one shaped by fear, in a slightly different way. The palace walls carried their silence like an echo, and the servants learned to read danger in the way the children moved through corridors, avoiding certain rooms, certain shadows, certain memories that clung to them like smoke. What most people never understood was how deeply the queen's paranoia intertwined with politics. The court was a battlefield disguised as ceremony, and every noble saw the royal heirs as living symbols of future alliances or future threats. The Red Queen understood this with ruthless clarity. She began to use her children as indicators of power, manipulating their public appearances to reinforce her dominance. When one child displeased her, she withdrew them from banquets or ceremonies, sending a message to rival families that loyalty was negotiable and affection a controlled commodity. Behind closed doors, she recorded every reaction, every flinch, every sign of hesitation. She believed these details revealed intentions, more accurately than any treaty or oath. The most unsettling development came when she introduced what witnesses later called the trial of silence. It was simple and cruel. For an entire day, each child had to remain expressionless while standing before her throne. Any sign of fear, confusion, or pain resulted in hours of isolation. She claimed it built discipline, but the truth was more insidious. She was studying them, probing their psychological breaking points, learning exactly how to manipulate each emotional fracture. This was no longer punishment. This was shaping, refining, weaponizing. The children adapted in different ways. The eldest learned to suppress emotion entirely, becoming a mirror of the queen's cold vigilance. The second-born became hyper-aware of every shift in atmosphere, anticipating danger before it formed. The youngest, too young to understand the rules, became the most vulnerable, clinging to scraps of affection with a desperation that only fueled the queen's control. These patterns would eventually determine their fate, though none of them yet realized how closely their mother was mapping their minds, cataloging their reactions like a scholar documenting a ritual. Meanwhile, the court grew uneasy. Nobles noticed the children's strained behavior, the hollow look in their eyes, the way they hesitated before speaking. Rumors began to circulate, quiet at first, then louder when a visiting ambassador described the royal heirs as haunted figures, shaped by a tyrant's hand. Yet no one dared confront the queen. She had already silenced rivals far more powerful. Challenging her authority meant accepting the risk of disappearing from the chronicles entirely. Still, cracks were forming beneath the surface. One child in particular, whose identity remained hidden in later records, began observing the queen in return, studying her habits just as she studied theirs. That small act of rebellion, silent and unnoticed, marked the beginning of a dangerous shift inside the palace. It was the first moment when fear and resistance collided, setting the stage for what would become the most defining conflict within the royal bloodline. The child who dared to study the Red Queen became the quiet fulcrum of an internal war no one else realized had begun. While the others focused solely on survival, this one observed patterns. The queen's footsteps, her silences, the moments when her voice lowered instead of rising, small details that revealed when her paranoia sharpened and when it withdrew. This child learned that the queen's fear, not her cruelty, dictated her worst decisions. And that knowledge became the first forbidden source of power inside the royal household. The shift unfolded gradually. The child started predicting the queen's mood before she entered a room. If she was in her volatile phase, they stepped back, avoided eye contact, lowered their breathing, becoming invisible. If she was in her calculating phase, they answered her questions with careful pauses, feeding her the illusions she craved. The Red Queen believed she was reading her child's mind, unaware that the roles were beginning to reverse. For the first time, someone beneath her roof understood the rhythm of her madness well enough to move around it. But this small awakening came with a cost. The other siblings noticed the change, and tension carved deeper divisions between them. They interpreted the child's new composure as favoritism, not strategy. In their desperation to survive, they began to resent what they perceived as a hidden alliance. The queen saw this growing jealousy, and instead of quelling it, she cultivated it. Division made her safer. Distrust ensured that none of the children could form an unbreakable bond strong enough to challenge her authority. Every quiet argument among them, every moment they competed for a smile or a word of praise, served her purpose. Meanwhile, the queen's rituals increased in complexity. She introduced new psychological tests disguised as lessons. One day she had them memorize contradictory rules, punishing whichever child failed to determine which rule she favored that hour. Another day she forced them to recite their own perceived weaknesses aloud, insisting it was preparation for leadership. In truth, she was manufacturing emotional fractures. Each confession became a weapon she stored away, ready to use when a child showed even the slightest hint of independence. The child, who studied her, absorbed these rituals differently. Instead of breaking under them, they learned to mask their reactions entirely. They trained themselves to cry without tears, to scream without sound, to bury panic beneath layers of practiced stillness. This mastery of emotional camouflage was something the queen recognized, though she misunderstood it. She believed the child was becoming like her, shaped in her image. She did not realize she was training her own future threat. Beyond the nursery walls, the nobles continued to speculate. Some thought the queen was preparing her heirs for future conflict, creating rulers capable of surviving treachery. Others whispered that she was cursed, driven mad by unspeakable forces that had infected the bloodline. None of them knew the truth. The queen was not shaping rulers. She was shaping obedience. She was building children who would fear her long after they were grown, ensuring her power extended beyond her lifetime. But the growing awareness inside the observing child introduced a new, unpredictable variable into the palace. It was not rebellion yet, not even defiance. It was simply understanding, dangerous, quiet understanding, of how control worked, how fear spread, and how authority could be dismantled from within. And once that awareness took root, the balance inside the royal household shifted in ways even the Red Queen, with all her vigilance, failed to detect. The shift inside the palace became impossible to ignore. When the Red Queen introduced what later chroniclers called the Chamber of Echoes, a room designed not for punishment, but for revelation. At least that was how she described it. In truth, it was a psychological crucible. A circular chamber lined with polished stone, where even the softest breath ricocheted back louder, distorting into something unsettling. She brought the children there one by one, insisting the acoustics exposed hidden thoughts. What truly emerged, however, were fragments of fear amplified until they felt like confessions. The observing child entered the chamber last. They already understood that the queen was shifting from manipulation to something even more invasive. She positioned them at the center, circling slowly, watching how every echo altered their composure. But unlike the others, this child had practiced silence too deeply for her to crack easily. Their heartbeat remained steady, their eyes fixed, their breathing controlled. The queen paused, intrigued. She sensed resistance, but she misread its nature. She believed it came from admiration-driven discipline rather than an emerging inner autonomy. Her misinterpretation was the first small mistake she made, though its consequences would not surface for years. Meanwhile, the court grew more suspicious. Certain nobles began sending their own spies into the palace to observe the heirs. The spies returned with fragmented accounts of sleepless children, strange training sessions, and a queen whose obsession had warped into something ritualistic. Yet, despite the growing concern, no one dared confront her. Her rule had been secured through fear, and fear remained her most effective weapon. Inside the family, the psychological landscape deteriorated. The eldest child, once stoic, began to break under the constant erosion of identity. Their emotional suppression became so severe that they no longer responded to their siblings, behaving instead like a living statue shaped by dread. The second-born, whose sensitivity once served as a survival tool, developed a paranoid hyper-awareness that bordered on hallucination. They started hearing echoes even outside the chamber, unsure whether the sounds were real or remnants of the queen's conditioning. The youngest, fragile and desperate for comfort, began mimicking their mother's traits in hopes of earning protection, unknowingly becoming a reflection of the very force that tormented them. The observing child, however, adapted differently. Their awareness grew sharper, their understanding deeper. They slowly realized that the queen's power did not depend on violence alone, but on the belief that she could perceive every hidden thought. If that illusion fractured, so would her dominion. This realization became the seed of something dangerous, something that, once nurtured, could dismantle the queen's entire system of control. But long before any confrontation emerged, the family dynamic mutated into something unrecognizable. Sibling alliances dissolved, trust evaporated. Every gesture was interpreted through a lens of potential betrayal. And through it all, the Red Queen watched with quiet satisfaction, believing she had shaped the perfect environment to preserve her throne. She had no idea the foundation beneath her was already shifting, destabilizing in ways subtle enough to escape her notice. As you take in these layers of fear, manipulation, and the psychological erosion unfolding inside the palace, I want to hear what struck you the most. Leave a comment sharing which part of this hidden history resonated with you or unsettled you, and how you imagine these children endured such a world. The deeper the Red Queen descended into her paranoia, the more the palace itself transformed into an extension of her mind. Every corridor, every chamber, every ritual meal became a stage for her unspoken tests. The children learned to read these shifting environments, sensing danger in the subtleties the court overlooked. The observing child in particular began noticing how servants hesitated before opening doors, how guards exchanged glances during routine patrols, how entire wings of the palace seemed to pulse with an anxiety no one dared voice. Something was building beneath the surface, a tension too controlled to be random, yet too pervasive to be coincidence. Within the family, however, the consequences of the queen's experiments began to manifest in unpredictable ways. The eldest child's emotional detachment, once a shield, became a void. They moved through the palace with a cold, mechanical precision, responding only when spoken to, and even then, with a delay that unsettled everyone who witnessed it. The second-born's hyper-awareness sharpened into a near-constant state of alarm. They flinched at faint sounds, froze at shifting shadows, and woke from dreams convinced the queen had summoned them for another test. The youngest, still craving affection, grew more erratic. Some days they clung to their siblings, begging for reassurance. Other days they imitated their mother's tone, issuing commands that echoed her authority with unsettling accuracy. Yet amid this chaos, the observing child's clarity only deepened. They began to map the patterns of the queen's paranoia, noticing that her cruelty intensified whenever the council challenged her decisions. Each political threat resulted in stricter rituals for the children, as if punishing them restored her sense of control. The child also realized that the queen rarely acted on impulse. Her outbursts were calculated, triggered by specific anxieties she tried to conceal. Understanding these triggers allowed the child to anticipate her actions with eerie accuracy, navigating danger not by avoiding it, but by predicting its shape. This growing insight, however, came at a psychological cost. The child's ability to anticipate the queen's moods made them appear unnervingly composed, drawing suspicion from both siblings and courtiers. Whispers began circulating that the queen favored this child above the rest, though in truth she did not. What she sensed was potential. Unlike the others, this one adapted rather than crumbled. This one learned rather than feared. This one, she believed, could become a successor molded entirely in her image if shaped with enough pressure. Her assumption would prove fatal. Outside the palace walls, Foreign emissaries reported troubling signs. Heirs who spoke. Little children trained like soldiers. A queen who isolated her own bloodline even during diplomatic ceremonies. Some ambassadors theorized that the royal family was cursed, while others believed the queen had fallen under the influence of forbidden practices. None could imagine the reality. The Red Queen was not under a spell. She was creating one. The spell was psychological, cast upon her children so deeply that even their reflections seemed altered by it. Still, the palace could not suffocate the truth forever. Servants noticed the children's growing fractures, the way they recoiled from touch, the nightmares that left them trembling at dawn. And quietly, without the queen's knowledge, one servant began documenting everything. Hidden notes, stolen observations, small details written in haste, fragments that would one day form the only surviving account of what happened behind those walls. This fragile record, though incomplete, hints at a turning point approaching within the family. The queen's control was tightening, but at the same time, an undercurrent of awareness was rising among those trapped beneath her rule. Something was beginning to shift, not loudly, but with the quiet inevitability of a storm forming beyond the horizon, waiting for the moment when the first crack in her dominion would finally appear. The storm approaching the Red Queen's dominion did not begin with rebellion or confrontation. It began with a single moment of hesitation, a flicker of vulnerability she never intended anyone to witness. Late one night, after the council delivered news of a regional uprising, the queen retreated to her private chamber. She believed herself alone, yet the observing child, quiet, sleepless, drawn by instinct, stood hidden in the shadows just beyond the threshold. Through a narrow gap in the carved doorframe, the child saw something unimaginable, the Red Queen trembling, not with rage, but with fear. That image rewrote everything the child thought. They understood. Until then, the queen had seemed unbreakable, a force of will wrapped in silk and steel. But in that single unguarded moment, she looked human, fragile, almost haunted by the weight of her own paranoia. The child realized that the queen's cruelty was not born from strength, but from terror. Terror of losing control. Terror of enemies both real and imagined. Terror that her own children might one day mirror the betrayals she feared. This understanding became a turning point. Power built on fear could be undermined. Authority born from insecurity could be fractured. And a mother who feared her children might, unknowingly, be forging the very defiance she hoped to prevent. The next morning, her behavior confirmed the shift. She summoned the children before dawn, inspecting each one with an intensity that bordered on desperation. She studied their expressions, their posture, the smallest variations in their breathing. She was searching for signs of rebellion, of doubt, of a threat she could not yet name. But beneath her scrutiny, something new emerged. Her gaze lingered longest on the observing child. There was suspicion in her eyes, but also confusion, as if she sensed a change she could not explain. Meanwhile, the other siblings continued their descent into instability. The eldest's emotional void deepened until they responded with alarming obedience, a level of compliance that frightened even the palace guards. The second-born's paranoia escalated into full psychological fragmentation. They began keeping secret maps of the palace, marking places where they believed the queen's influence weakened. The youngest, once desperate for affection, began imitating the queen's mannerisms with unnerving precision, testing commands on servants and reacting violently when disobeyed. Each child mirrored a different fragment of the queen's distorted legacy, but the observing child represented something the queen could not control: insight. Quiet, growing, and dangerous insight. They began reconstructing the palace's hierarchy in their mind, realizing that the queen relied on more than fear. She relied on predictability. She controlled the environment so thoroughly that the children had never questioned the rules. but once questioned, the rules cracked. If she could be frightened, she could be destabilized. If she could be destabilized, her rituals could be disrupted. And if her rituals could be disrupted, her psychological dominion might finally loosen its grip. Outside the family, the council sensed instability. Factions whispered about succession, about heirs too damaged to lead, about the queen's erratic decisions jeopardizing the kingdom's future. A few considered intervention, though none dared speak openly. The queen's history of eliminating rivals was legendary, and no one wished to become the next vanished name in the royal archives. Yet the system she built, the rituals, the isolation, the psychological warfare, had begun turning inward, consuming itself. The queen could not see that her greatest threat was no longer beyond the palace walls. It stood quietly among her own children, watching her with the same unblinking precision she once used to watch them. And though the observing child did not yet know how or when the shift would happen, they understood one truth with absolute clarity. The balance of power had changed, and it would never tilt in the queen's favor again with the same certainty it once did. The first undeniable rupture in the Red Queen's control emerged not from defiance, but from a miscalculation she never realized she had made. In her growing paranoia, she began conducting nightly inspections of the children's chambers, convinced that rebellion could manifest in the smallest deviation. A hidden note, a whispered conversation, a misplaced object. But the night everything shifted, she opened the door to the eldest child's room and found something she had not anticipated. The eldest was sitting upright on the bed, awake, motionless, staring into the darkness as though listening to someone speak. But no one else was there. When she demanded an explanation, the eldest did not respond. They did not blink. They seemed trapped in some internal labyrinth shaped by years of psychological erosion. For the first time, the queen wavered. She had pushed one of her children so far that their identity had fractured into unrecognizable pieces. It was not obedience. It was collapse. And collapse was unpredictable. Collapse could not be commanded or molded. Collapse could spread. For hours after that moment, the queen remained in the corridor, pacing with a tension so visible that even the guards avoided her gaze. The observing child watched from the shadows, analyzing every gesture. The queen touched the wall repeatedly, tapping her fingers in a nervous rhythm, a habit she had only shown during political crises. But this was not about politics. This was something far more dangerous. Her fear was no longer abstract. For the first time, she understood that her own methods had produced outcomes she could not control. Meanwhile, the second-born, increasingly unstable, interpreted the eldest's deterioration as a sign. Not a warning, but an omen. They began speaking of the palace as if it were alive, claiming that the walls listened, that footsteps carried messages, that their mother's scrutiny had awakened something in the architecture itself. Servants grew, terrified of encountering them in corridors, unsure whether they faced a frightened child or a mind unraveling beyond recovery. The youngest, puzzled and frightened by these changes, began to cling more tightly to the observing child, sensing that they were the only sibling who had not surrendered to the fear that governed their world. The observing child, however, saw the situation differently. They recognized that the queen's system was beginning to crack. The hierarchy she constructed depended on reactions she could anticipate: fear, obedience, silence. But fractured minds behaved unpredictably, and if unpredictability spread, her rituals would lose their power. Her entire kingdom of control would collapse under its own weight. Still, the queen did not abandon her methods. Instead, she intensified them. She forced the children into new rituals, longer tests of endurance, stranger psychological trials she believed would restore control. But the more she pressed, the more the palace shifted from a place of structured fear into a maze of unstable emotions. The children were no longer simply victims. They were becoming catalysts, each carrying a different fragment of chaos that threatened to unravel everything she had built. And in that chaos, the observing child saw something the queen never could: the possibility of change. Not rebellion, not escape, not yet, but the faint beginnings of a power the queen had never meant to give them: awareness. And awareness, once awakened, could never be suppressed again. Before we continue, I would really like to hear your thoughts. Which part of this psychological unraveling inside the Red Queen's palace struck you the most? Leave a comment sharing your interpretation or the moment that impacted you most. The palace entered a new phase of instability when the Red Queen, desperate to regain control, restructured the children's routines into a rigid sequence of rituals meant to erase any deviation she sensed growing. Among them, dawn began with forced silence, midday with examinations disguised as lessons, night with interrogations framed as guidance. Yet for all her efforts, the foundation beneath her authority continued to erode because the children were no longer responding in predictable ways. Fear had shaped them, but now fear fractured them. The eldest child, once the embodiment of perfect obedience, began drifting through the palace like a ghost. They followed instructions, but without intention, without comprehension. Servants whispered that they sometimes found the eldest standing in empty halls, murmuring fragments of old lessons as if trying to recall who they were before the queen remade them. The queen noticed this deterioration, but refused to acknowledge it. Admitting the damage meant admitting her methods were flawed, and her pride would not allow such recognition. Instead, she intensified the isolation, believing deprivation would restore discipline. It did not. It only hollowed the eldest further, turning them into a living reminder of the limits of her power. The second-born spiraled downward in a different direction. Fueled by paranoia, they began creating patterns out of the palace's sounds, convinced the echoes were messages meant only for them. They developed an elaborate system of markings on the walls, attempting to track what they believed were shifting loyalties among servants, guards, even shadows. When the queen discovered these markings, she interpreted them as rebellion rather than desperation. Her response was swift and merciless. She ordered the child confined for days at a time, believing containment would break the obsessive patterns. Instead, it sharpened them. The second-born emerged with eyes that searched every movement, every breath, as if the world itself had become a code they were determined to decipher. The youngest child, shaped by a need for affection that had never been met, began taking on traits that unsettled everyone around them. They imitated the queen's posture, her gestures, the cadence of her voice. Servants found them issuing commands with an authority that felt unnatural for someone so young. But beneath the imitation, there was fragility, a dangerous mixture of mimicry and longing. The queen recognized a reflection of herself in the youngest and saw potential, but she misread its source. It was not strength. It was survival instinct, contorted into emulation. Through all of this, the observing child watched the family unravel with increasing clarity. They noticed how the queen's control faltered, not because her methods softened, but because her methods collided with the unpredictable reactions she had created. The queen believed she understood the architecture of the mind, but she had built her system on assumptions that no longer held. The children had fractured into separate psychological worlds, each shaped by the same force, but reacting in divergent, uncontrollable ways. And still, the queen pressed forward, convinced she could contain the chaos if she simply applied more pressure. She summoned scholars, mystics, advisors who specialized in discipline, demanding new strategies to restore unity among her heirs. None dared admit what they truly observed. That unity was impossible because the children no longer trusted one another, no longer trusted themselves, no longer believed in anything except the unpredictable violence of their mother's will. The Observing child realized something none of the others could see. The queen was losing the coherence of her own narrative. Her rituals no longer inspired fear in the same way. They inspired confusion. Confusion was dangerous. Confusion created openings. And in those openings, even the most carefully constructed reign could begin to crumble. The moment the Red Queen's authority truly began to slip was so subtle that no one recognized it for what it was. It began with a single directive she issued during a council meeting. A minor order, easily enforced, yet the guards hesitated before carrying it out. That hesitation, barely a breath, barely a shift of weight, was enough to expose a truth the queen had spent years denying. Fear was no longer absolute. Fear had begun to decay. Inside the palace, the consequences surfaced quickly. Servants who once moved with rigid precision now exchanged glances when the queen passed. Advisors who once bowed without question now paused before speaking, weighing their words not just for safety, but for purpose. The queen sensed these changes and responded with escalating rigidity, tightening her rituals, restricting movement, amplifying scrutiny. But the harder she pulled, the more evident it became that her grip was slipping. The children felt this shift with an instinct sharper than any noble's understanding. They had lived their entire lives attuned to the fluctuations of her authority. When her certainty cracked, the entire system that governed their existence trembled. The eldest child's vacant obedience deepened into a haunting stillness, as though they were waiting for a command the queen no longer knew how to give. The second-born's paranoia adapted to the new instability, transforming into a fragile, volatile alertness that made every sound feel like a threat. The youngest, sensing opportunity in the queen's growing desperation, began testing boundaries, offering small acts of disobedience disguised as childish mistakes. These subtle rebellions went unnoticed at first, small cracks growing inside a structure built on brittle foundations. Only the observing child understood what those cracks meant. They watched the queen more closely than ever, noting how her eyes darted to corners she once ignored, how she repeated commands as though trying to convince herself of their necessity, how her once meticulous composure now fractured under the strain of maintaining a collapsing narrative. The child recognized the signs of unraveling, not in her cruelty, but in the way she questioned her own control. Self-doubt, once foreign to her, now shadowed her every decision. Outside the royal chambers, the kingdom sensed an opening. Rival factions whispered that the queen had weakened. Advisors debated succession in hidden chambers. Even distant regions emboldened their defiance, interpreting the queen's erratic decrees as evidence of instability. The palace, once an impenetrable center of authority, had become a focal point of speculation. But the most dangerous shift emerged from within. Servants assigned to watch the children began exchanging information. Subtle observations passed through coded glances and small gestures. They noted the queen's unpredictable temper, the youngest child's imitation of her power, the second-born's frantic behavior, the observing child's calm clarity. It was through these silent exchanges that a quiet network formed, a network not built to challenge the queen, but to survive her potential downfall. The queen, however, misinterpreted these developments. Convinced that threats surrounded her, she withdrew deeper into isolation, emerging only to enforce harsher rituals. She believed she was tightening control, unaware that her actions were accelerating the erosion of fear, the very emotion that maintained her throne. And amid the widening chaos, the observing child saw what no one else could yet articulate. The queen's reign was still dangerous, still suffocating, but no longer inevitable. What once felt like an unbreakable cycle had begun to shift, subtly but irreversibly. The question was no longer whether her dominance would falter, but when, and who among her children would be standing when it did. As the Red Queen's authority fractured, The palace entered a state so volatile that even the air seemed to hold its breath. The rituals she once relied upon no longer produced obedience but confusion. The children, shaped by years of psychological warfare, no longer responded as she expected. Each carried a different manifestation of her legacy, yet none behaved according to her design. The eldest, hollow and unresponsive, drifted between rooms like a remnant of someone who once existed. The second-born, now fully consumed by patterns only they could decipher, began drawing symbols on the stone floors, symbols the queen insisted were treasonous. The youngest, emboldened by the queen's instability, toyed with small acts of rebellion, testing which boundaries remained enforced and which had silently collapsed. But the true shift came from the observing child, whose clarity had sharpened into something the queen could neither predict nor suppress. They understood now that the queen's power was sustained by a single fragile illusion, that she alone perceived every threat. Once that illusion cracked, her dominion faltered, and what the child had witnessed, the trembling in the queen's private chamber, the hesitation of the guards, the growing unrest among nobles, proved that the illusion had already shattered. Still, the queen persisted in her rituals. She summoned the children to the Hall of Veils, a chamber once used for coronation rites, but now repurposed for her own psychological experiments. Thin silks hung from the ceiling, shifting with each breath of air, creating distorted reflections of the children as they stood before her. She declared that a final test was required, one that would determine their loyalty. But what she did not realize was that loyalty had ceased to exist. Fear remained, but it no longer bound them to her. It merely lingered like smoke, an echo of a power that had begun to wither. During this final test, something unprecedented occurred. The eldest did not respond. The second-born spoke out of turn. The youngest openly questioned her instructions. And the observing child, who understood better than anyone that this moment marked the collapse of an entire era, stood without reacting at all. It was the silence of someone who no longer believed in the authority standing before them. The queen saw it. She recognized it. And for the first time in her long, merciless reign, she took a step back. That single step reverberated through the room like an unspoken declaration. The children felt it. The guards felt it. Even the walls, steeped in years of whispered fear, seemed to recognize the shift. Her reign had not ended in rebellion or bloodshed. It ended in a realization. Her children were no longer her creation. They had become something else, fragments shaped by trauma, sharpened by insight, and united not by loyalty, but by the shared understanding that her power no longer defined them. This moment marked the beginning of the kingdom's transformation. Chronicles would later debate what followed, whether the queen withdrew or was quietly removed, whether her children restored the realm or fractured it further. But those debates miss the deeper truth. The true legacy of the Red Queen was not written in the policies she enforced or the battles she won. It was written in the psychological labyrinth she created, and in the children who emerged from it, damaged, yes, but awake in ways she had never intended. If you stayed with this story until now, it means the hidden history behind the Red Queen's household struck something in you. So leave a comment saying, "This message was for me to let me know you reached the end." If this deep dive into forgotten power resonated with you, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Tap like to strengthen the channel. And if you want to continue unraveling histories just as dark and revealing, there is another video waiting for you right here.